Happy launch week of TFT Set 11 Inkborn Fables. Over the past couple weeks, I talked to many pros, watched a couple of tournaments, and also played over 100 games to really get the pulse of the meta. So let's go ahead and dive into the tier list and see what it's about before we get started. Starting at the S tier, we have a handful of reroll comps, as well as 2 4-cost AP units in Syndra and Lillia that I think are going to be particularly strong. I think that AP is a lot stronger than AD in general to start off launch, because the premier 4-costs, Syndra and Lillia, are much better than Ashe and Kai'Sa as the backline threats. And then the secondary carries like Lee Sin and Kayn, they are AD carries, but they are worse than Morgana and Sylas. And so in general, if you want to say play open and you're not entirely sure what to play, kind of let TFT come to you, I'd recommend leaning towards the AP tree because it generally seems a lot stronger. Meanwhile, on the AD side, you kind of have to commit early, but the payoff is some of these AD comps are really, really strong, particularly around Yone. He's the best comp in the game. Yone is really strong for 2 reasons. One, Yone is just really difficult to deal with once he gets to 3 stars. He goes to the back line and assassinates a lot of carries. And so he's kind of like an assassin, but also a melee carry that just kind of annihilates frontline as well if your opponent's not careful and doesn't have really strong tank. And the second thing is Elune is really, really powerful because she also spreads a lot of damage and executes. So even if Yone leaves him alive barely, a lot of times Elune is able to clean up. And if you're able to get something powerful like Gunblade on Elune, you're able to heal that frontline a lot. Yone doesn't really fall off because you can really assassinate a lot of backline and then be able to push levels, go to level 8, level 9, even on Yone too. Teemo and Bard are both trick shots, and while they do have different comps that you do want to play around, Teemo leans a lot towards 4 trick shot plus like Storyweaver, and Bard leans a little bit more into Mythic. I just think trick shot might be overtuned in general. I think that maybe they just buffed it a little bit too much on the final patch, and Teemo in particular is really stable even at 2-star, and ends up being a really powerful mid-game unit to play around, even if you're not trying to reroll him. Bard is probably the most fun 3-cost to play around, in my opinion, this set. He's super cool. He's an attack speed carry, and he also scales off of both physical and magical damage. And so you can give him things like both Infinity Edge or a bunch of AP items, and it all kind of works, as long as you have Rage Blade to make sure that he keeps attacking and throwing those meeps. Gnar is one of the comps that actually skyrocketed in popularity thanks to China during the PB Masters tournament. Gnar, Senna, and Aatrox are a trio that you reroll, and much stronger than playing around Gnar and Kindred. And so I recommend playing around Gnar as a tank and then using Senna as backline DPS. Lillia is played with Mythic and Invoker, so you have a couple variations. And Syndra is played either with Arcanist or Fated. Ashe, like I said, is the most reliable AD carry, and she has a high ceiling. If you're able to get Porcelain Emblem and play around 4 Porcelain without having to play like Lux, she is very, very strong. If you're able to get a Porcelain Emblem on a frontline unit, you have an unkillable frontline. If you're able to get it on, say, like a Nautilus 2 or an Ornn 2, whoever you're able to kind of tag alongside your frontline, Ashe ends up being able to scale really hard, and you get a Rage Blade on her with some AD items, she's going to go to town. Janna is a surprisingly really powerful 2-cost reroll, and also an alternative to like the Teemo and the Gnar. If you do end up seeing like more 2-cost reroll, try giving Janna a shot. Aphelios is really good at his high peak potential, but the problem is getting there. 2-star Aphelios is good, and then all of a sudden he does like nothing until you hit Aphelios 3. And so you have this like window where Aphelios kind of doesn't do anything, and you feel like you're falling off really hard, and you're kind of scrabbling together. And then you hit Aphelios 3, and maybe you can win out, only to run into like a Yone player or a trick shot that burst your back line, and Aphelios kind of struggles. Zoe is a variation of Syndra. Usually you kind of like build items for like Teemo, Syndra, Zoe with like blue buff, death cap, gunblade, gnashers, things like that. And with Zoe, you reroll another 3-cost like Soraka and try to play either around Storyweaver, or you can play Zoe with Arcanist and kind of just have her substitute instead of Syndra, and you have a little bit of optionality there. Morgana, Kayn, and Sylas are all like a little package, which I'll explain in a little bit, but it's very flexible, and they're all really strong as long as you activate their baseline traits. Like as long as you get like 2 Sage and Ghostly, Morgana's pretty good. Same thing with Kayn, 2 Ghostly, 2 Reaper, and Sylas, 2 Umbral, 2 Bruiser. As long as you get them, you can make them really work, and they even all fit together in a composition, which I'll show you in a little bit. Kai'Sa, like we said, is very dependent on her Ink Shadow item. Her best item is Tattoo of Bombardment. If you get other things, I highly recommend not playing Kai'Sa as your primary, unless you want to go vertical Ink Shadow, which is pretty hit or miss. I think it to be really high roll with a lot of economy and basically be far ahead by hitting a bunch of 2-stars early. Lee Sin is played around a Dragon Lord / Heavenly Core, and you can kind of play Lee Sin as a carry. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Zed, where it's just, he kind of gets in AD burst and then tries to make his way to the back line systemically, but he's not actually as good at getting to the back line like Zed is. Ahri reroll is actually surprisingly really good, and you play around Fated with Arcanists, and you can even reroll Yasuo. I think that she is B tier because in reality, if everybody gets their comps online, Ahri can struggle, but I do think she's capable of breaking to that A or S tier, depending on how the meta is. I think one downside is there's not many one cost reroll in the meta, so you don't have other people pulling one cost for you. And so it's going to be really tricky. Tristana is a duelist composition where you reroll Tristana and Volibear. And Tristana is really fun too. She kind of dives in and bombs and then jumps away to safety. So a little bit of like that Ezreal flair, but with Tristana abilities. And Tristana does scale with just the raw 80 that you want, like Infinity Edge, Lost Whisper, Giant Slayer, things like that. Kindred, I think, is much worse to carry than Senna for Gnar, but if you do play Kindred and you want to play like a Dryad-based strategy, you can go for it. I'll show you how. Soraka, Kog'Maw, and Kha'Zix, these are compositions that I think you kind of need like a really, really good setup to make it work. There's a couple of augments that make these specific carries really good, like Kog'Maw has a sniper-focused augment that after you attack a certain range, you get a sniper's focus. Kha'Zix has like heavenly reroll augments that help you hit Kha'Zix really fast, and then as a result, push levels and hit like 7 heavenly really quick. And Soraka as a primary is really weak now that they nerfed her a lot. She was played with Diana, but now I think she is just better as a support DPS unit alongside like Zoe, or if you reroll Janna and you kind of have like Soraka in that mix, you can go for Soraka 3 there, but as a primary carry, she's just not that reliable. And then I put into D tier all the hero augments only because you shouldn't reroll these unless you hit the hero augments. And so it kind of just depends if you have the spot for it. At their peak power level, Yorick and Shen can actually be an S tier, but you need to hit their hero augment plus another specific augment called Raid Boss. And if you have those, it's kind of like you have 2 hero augments and they become completely unkillable if you're able to hit relatively on curve. So Yorick and Shen, I would recommend, are the 2 best hero augments. And then Garen's like fun. I think if you get the stars align moment for him, he's probably around high B. And Kabuko is kind of a meme, but you can actually find some decent tempo options with him if you hit really early. You could probably pay him like top of C tier, bottom of B tier. So the verdict, I think, is going to be a reroll meta. I think about 65-35, maybe skews more towards 50-50 if a lot of people feel like 4 costs are really good. And it might depend on the rank that you're playing or, you know, how experienced some people are at your elo. And the usual rules have applied and stayed the same. At level 5, you roll for 1 cost. At level 6, you roll for 2 costs. And at level 7, you roll for 3 costs. If there are exceptions, I'll talk about the comps following right now. Yone, while is the strongest comp in the game, does have a couple of variations that you can play. The first variation is to play as many Umbrals as you can and try to illuminate the whole board, which removes the need to actually position kind of like in the moon crescent shape. Unlike KDA from Remix Rumble in the previous set, KDA had a bunch of different patterns. There's only 2 patterns that you can hit with Umbral, which is a right-shaped crescent or a left-shaped crescent, and that's basically it. And the way you have to position is how I lay it out, where you either play all here on the right side or you play it all on the left side like this. And as you can see, there's only 1 hex that, you know, this Yone can Uber, while this Kayn has to take the local bus and public transportation, so he's just gonna take a long time to get there. And you also don't even get him next to things like the Even Shroud if you end up playing that way. So a lot of times you want to eliminate the whole board, which is really, really nice. If you do get an Umbral emblem, the best holder of it is Kayn, and 2-star Kayn with extra 80 items is very good. But as you know, that there's a lot of different ways to itemize this composition, because in the end you do want to have like an Even Shroud so that Yone doesn't get stuck on a frontline unit too long. And then you want to also have like items for Sylas too, or if you even hit a Kayn 2, you have items for him. If you do hit the Umbral emblem, try to play a nice backline unit that can synergize like Morgana and get Ghostly. If you don't play 6 Umbral, you can also play for 4 Reaper, and that's usually played off a Reaper emblem. And in this case, if you do hit a Reaper emblem, you end up putting it on a Sylas. Or if you hit 2-star Morgana, you can put it on Morgana as well, then play a 4th Reaper accordingly. The thing about Yone to keep in mind is that he does dash a certain amount of distance, and so positioning him does matter. And there are some times where, assuming you don't even have sets, let's just put set over here, you might even put him in the front center because of the way his dash range can work. And you also do want to make sure that he's kind of in safety range, because he doesn't really play a lot of defensive items currently. You do have a couple of variations where if you don't want to play Yone like high risk, high reward with high damage, you can put like a Quicksilver on him or an Edge of Night. And as a result, augments like Not Today obviously synergize with him as well. But the way Chan likes to play him is more damage oriented. So like Titans, Bloodthirster, and either another healing item like Hodge or like Infinity Edge like I showed you. In general, roll at level 7 for Yone. But as I was saying at the beginning of the tier list, if you are just not hitting Yone 3 for whatever reason, like you're contested, you can just like push levels with Yone, especially if you have something like Reaper Emblem or Umbral Emblem, and then just play around a powerful 5 cost that makes sense for the composition and focus on hitting set 2 with, let's say, like an Udyr 2. And if you give him like an Umbro emblem and then you instead move items over to set and Udyr and just get like, I don't know, like Hodge and GS or something for Udyr, then you can actually win the game just like this as well. And that's like another really powerful option that you can do with Yone if you're not hitting. Teemo is really, really strong, particularly because I think 4 Trick Shot is just overtuned. Trick Shot is the ricochet ability similar to Sharpshooters from set 4, if you remember that, where you shoot an ability and then it bounces off a wall and shoots another projectile. And so it actually has a lot of backline access, and you'd be surprised how quickly a Teemo 3 with a bunch of damage items with 4 Trick Shot can delete backline. Teemo is also really stable at 2-star, and so even if you have like blue buff and death cap on Teemo and you only have Teemo 2, you can actually like full streak both stage 2 and stage 3 with Teemo 2. And then you hit Teemo 3 and then you like win the game with 80 HP. That's happened multiple times in competitive lobbies that I've been in with top challenger players. Teemo's best in slot items are blue buff, death cap, and gunblade. But the one thing I want to talk about with Teemo is that blue buff, while it is the best mana item, you also don't have to greed entirely for it because sometimes you just can't get 2 tiers. Teemo is 30 mana, so 2 attacks with blue buff will help him cast. But you can also play Shojin on Teemo if you don't get a 2nd tier for blue buff. And you can also play an adaptive. They both actually have the same amount of breakpoint and Teemo can cast. Plus, adaptive helm gives a little bit of AP as well for being in the back 2 rows. So don't feel like you always 100 have to go for blue buff, because I have seen a lot of Teemo players greed too much for it. And while blue buff is better, this is probably like a good A-, and don't feel like you can't just play Teemo without any tier items. Because if you end up in a situation where you're playing, let's say, like a Giant Slayer and you have no mana items for Teemo, you're going to struggle a lot. A couple other things to note. Galio in general loves Stoneplate because Galio's ability taunts, and when he taunts, everyone attacks him. So Stoneplate gives you more resistances and value. So you can kind of position kind of like this. If you have Stoneplate, you don't have to do something wonky like solo frontline Galio. He will taunt. The other thing is that Sivir also buffs adjacent allies with her attack speed, and that means that you want her next to Teemo, but you don't have to put her strictly between her and one of the unit. You can actually technically have Sivir above, for example, and position like this if you really want to, and she will buff the Teemo and the Xayah. The best Kayle Storyweaver that you want usually is a Talisman of Aid, and that is because you are able to shred and sunder, and so that you don't need things like Shiv or Spark. But if you don't have Kayle's for whatever reason, like you took Talisman of Speed for attack speed, you need to have that shred. So don't ignore things like a Spark and a Shiv. And while in this example we play 4 bruisers, you totally can also mix and match whatever makes sense. So for example, you can drop this Silas and Aatrox, and you can totally just play like 2 Wardens. Let's say you have Nautilus and you're like playing Garen because that's just like your early game that you have. And yeah, you have 4 Storyweaver, but you know, maybe you end up hitting a Storyweaver emblem and now you have 5 Storyweaver. And then you can also do, you know, behemoths. Let's say you hit a Shen and you hit a Ornn, and now all of a sudden you have like, you know, 2 behemoth and 2 bruiser. A lot of flexibility with frontline as long as you kind of get that 4 trick shot. I will say though, don't try to play 4 trick shot too quickly. People try to go for Teemo and they end up playing something like this where they play like 2 frontliners and 4 trick shots in the back. You're going to be rolling on 6 a lot for Teemo because he's a level 6 reroll comp, and so level 6 you roll for 2 costs. So don't be in a situation like this where, you know, let's say instead of Xayah you have the Bard for the trick shot and your frontline is complete bollocks. So just make sure that you balance it out the other way. Cut 2 trick shots, play Sivir Teemo, and play more frontline. Bard is one of the most fun carries in the entire set, and he's also the other trick shot that I think is quite overtuned. Bard really loves attack speed, so you really want to get Gintu's Rage Blade on him because the more he attacks, the more damage he does with meeps. And because he scales with both AD AP, you can play things like Giant Slayer or other things that scale both AD or AP. So like, for example, I've seen people play like Rageblade Shiv or Rageblade Last Whisper or Rageblade Guardbreaker, even like Deathblade and Infinity Edge. You can do a lot of different things on Bard. But in terms of what I would pick 3 items, I would pick Rageblade, Giant Slayer, and now Gunblade, because Gunblade is really powerful to help heal your frontline, and there's a lot of AoE in the set. Kind of similar to Teemo, Sivir buffs adjacently, and you also want probably some kind of shred with Kale, so you can go ahead and add a Talisman of Aid. Don't get too greedy with positioning, so sometimes you do want to get value off of Sivir adjacently, but maybe you just have like this to bait a lot of the things like Nautilus, for example. And speaking of Nautilus, you have him as part of your frontline with 5 Mythic, and this is like one setup that you can play around Bard. You could also play around 4 Trickshot with Bard, but you do struggle a little bit more with frontline because Tahm Kench, even though you have him as 3-star and he's a lot of HP, he's actually more of a carry than he is a tank. And so you don't actually have as much reliable frontline. And the Mythic also gives you a lot more damage to scale with Bard. So it's kind of nice for him to get extra 80 in AP. Bard's a 3 cost, so roll at 7. And make sure you try to position Bard away from other people's carries because he is really powerful the second half of the fight due to Rage Blade scaling. You don't want Bard to be on the same side as like the Yone because the Yone is just going to come here and shoot down to Bard. And he's not going to be ready. You want him to kind of have time so he can scale up. Another really good augment for Bard is, I think, Pandora's, because you just need so many like specific like bows and rods and swords. If you kind of look at this setup, you need 2 rods, 2 swords, and 2 bows. And that just requires you a lot of the same type of item. And then Tahm Kench kind of just takes like whatever defensive item. Declaw ends up being really good in this meta in general because there's so much AP. And so you can always play that plus, you know, damage reduction and then some anti-heal. Syndra is the most powerful 4-cost carry, I think, to play around consistently because she is really powerful at her top end. She can win a lot of games, and she has a couple different variations depending on your spatulas and how many resources you have. In fact, Syndra is also one of the reliable comps to play from a lose streak. So if you're in a spot where you're like, hey, I'm actually like losing a lot of HP and I don't know what to play from behind, Syndra ends up being very, very good. Her best unsought items are Blue Buff and Death Cap and Gunblade. Blue Buff to cast a lot. Syndra scales with the more you cast. Every single time she casts her ability, she gets 1 extra projectile, aka butterfly. And so if she's able to cast 10 times, she'll cast 10 more butterflies, which is in each instance of damage and ends up scaling. And so Syndra theoretically is like the ultimate overtime unit because she just keeps scaling. And if you don't kill her fast enough, she just becomes too hard to handle. Death Cap is actually just way better of a damage scaler than Jewel Gauntlet, but you could also play Jewel Gauntlet here. And Gunblade because you just want to heal your frontline. Your frontline is often dictated by how reliable and how quickly you can get 3-star Alawi or a Mumu, even Thresh if you needed. And because of the way Fated works, Fated ends up having a unit where you have to pair 2 units and build your own trait. Each of these units have different bonus, kind of like True Damage from Remix Rumble, where if you gave True Damage Bling bonus to Kennen, it was a different buff than giving it to Senna, which is a different buff to give it to Echo. It's the same thing here. The Fated bonus on Thresh is different than the Fated bonus on Ahri, which is different than the Fated bonus on Syndra. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, just pair Ahri with Syndra almost always when you're playing Syndra carry or Ahri carry, because Ahri gives AP and Syndra gives bonus damage. And so they just complement each other really well by multiplying off each other. If you pair Thresh with Syndra, Thresh gives you magic resistance and armor. And that's not what you really need because the pair gets the Fated bonus, but let's say Syndra gets armor and magic resistance. Wouldn't you just rather have the AP and nuke all the enemies instead? It might be a little bit confusing at first, but basically if you see like a Lotus above all your Fated champions, it means you don't have a pairing. And once you successfully hold a unit over another, you'll see like this little soul breath link that connects them, and that'll confirm that you have your Fated pairing. This is a level 8 board though, even though you're trying to go for like Alawi 3, a Mumu 3 or whatever and itemize all of them, you ultimately still want to get to 8 because Syndra 2 does matter. You could roll on 7 if you're super desperate, but don't expect to hit Syndra 2 consistently. The other variation that you can play with Syndra is to just go for vertical Fated. 7 Fated is really good, and also 10 Fated just wins the game, but you need 3 emblems for that, so don't expect to hit it very easily. And basically what you do is you get that Fated bonus, but it multiplies across all the Fated champions. So instead of just 2 units getting the Fated bonus, if you just hovered over Ahri and Syndra in 3 Fated, you only get 30 AP and 10% bonus damage. But now Syndra gets 90 AP and 30% bonus damage, and Ahri gets 90 AP and 30% bonus damage, and everybody else gets 90 AP and 30% bonus damage. So it's a lot of stats for all your Fated champions if you can get. And you can put it on Alawi because, yes, she doesn't really benefit from the bonus damage, but she does benefit from the AP and it keeps her alive. Or you can just put it on another unit that makes a lot of sense. Let's say you play like Ornn as a behemoth, +1 with Thresh. Just go ahead and go for that. And just connect like 4 Arcanists if you want. But this is another variation of Syndra that's really powerful that you can win if you get a Fated +1. Honestly, you don't really need the 7 Fated +1, but it is really good if you can get it. Lillia loves to play around Invokers because Invokers at 6 gives a lot of mana to the point where you don't actually even need to have mana items on Lillia, but you probably should. In fact, I have an item set up here where she has like a bunch of AP with Deathcap, Jewel Gauntlet, and Gunblade. This is like the best case scenario that you can land in with Lillia, but the chances are you actually are going to slam mana items because you need to have a mana item to get to this spot in the first place. Like you're not going to just play these 3 items and get to, 8 or 9 and play all this board because how did you survive early mid game by playing no mana on any of your 1s and 2 costs on your way to Lillia? So a lot of times you end up going for, say, like a blue buff instead here, or a death cap instead of a jewel gauntlet. And 6 Invoker with 3 Mythic is going to be the baseline set of what you play. Annie is your frontline tank. And remember, Annie also gives you anti-heal, so you don't necessarily need like Umbrella or Sunfire, but you also could double up on it, so Annie does more damage. And then you can also just like kind of play around with this. So instead of 6 Invoker, you can also cut 2 of them, like cut Alun and Janna. And instead, you can play around more Mythic if you hit Hui, and let's just play Nico for a little bit more frontline. This is a completely viable way to also play where you go 5 Mythic, 4 Invoker instead. And you also know where this is going. If you get a Mythic Emblem, you can totally also just play for a Mythic +1 and then go for 7 Mythic instead and find different ways you can mix and match your board. So because of this reason, Lillia is pretty versatile. And a lot of times the way you end up deciding how you want to play around your Mythic and Invoker breakpoints is the Exalted. Exalted is one of the more complicated mechanics to explain, but the short end of it is that it's kind of like Jazz. It just gives you a bunch of bonus energy at the expense of being random every single game. You can't really predict your Exalted. And so a lot of times, if your Lillia's an Exalted, you can always kind of make the Mythic and the Invoker breakpoints based on what other 2 other Exalted units, like Nautilus, for example, or a Galio, and then you can kind of like play around that. So it often kind of depends on what other 2 Exalted are. So let's say Lillia is your headliner, but it's also like Galio and maybe like a Thresh. Then that means instead of playing around like these other traditional Mythic setups, you can instead cut down like the number of Invokers entirely and play around these traits that make sense. So you have like Ornn for your front line, and then you can play like Sylas as your secondary carry, and then as a result, you have like Exalted, and you can start to itemize Sylas as your secondary carry instead. Oh, I realized I actually didn't have a Mythic in here, so in this case, we have so much front line, we can just play Kog'Maw and then cut, and there you go. Now all of a sudden you have the Mythic with the Invokers, and now you can kind of like play around this as your core. Oh, and the other thing to note is that Lillia's positioning does really matter because she shoots through the champion and deals damage in a line to whoever's behind with her cast. And so that does require some positioning nuance, but the summary of it is usually you play her on the corners. And if you need to put her in the center because their backline units are in the back center, then just do that instead. Just play around with it, have fun. She's very strong, and more importantly, she's very fun. Gnar is one of the big revelations that we had from the PBE tournament. People thought that you want to reroll Gnar with Kindred because, well, it made sense. You had 2-cost Dryads, so just roll 2-cost Dryad at level 6 with Gnar and Kindred, and then, voila, you have Gnar 3, Kindred 3. The only thing is that the damage didn't really line up because Kindred was an AP champion and Gnar was an AD champion. And so what China did was they found that Senna was really good as an AD backline carry to complement Gnar, and you can roll for not only an Aatrox, but you can also utilize this Ink Shadow item as well and kind of use it interchangeably depending on who it's best for. So if you get Tattoo of Force, for example, ends up being a really good stun item for Aatrox, or if you get things like a Tattoo of Bombardment, you can also put it on Kai'Sa, and so on and so forth. You have like different options depending on what you get. Ink Shadow is very, very fun trait. It's kind of like Gadgettine from set 8, where you get like a random item that's juiced up. It's supposed to be a little bit stronger than your average item, so prioritize having that as your 3rd carry item or your 3rd tank item, and try to roll for Gnar 3. Caitlyn 3 is particularly interesting because she ends up taking a lot of leftover items that sometimes don't even make sense. In one tournament, for example, someone put like Morello and like Shiv on this Caitlyn, and it just like popped off because she just had 3 items and did a lot of damage. So yeah, just don't even worry about it. Just like put 3 damage items where left over on Caitlyn, and it's good. And then the other aspect of it, part of what makes this comp really strong is that it abuses Warden very well. And Warden is one of the best frontline traits that you can possibly play. In fact, most people will suggest that Warden is just the best frontline period currently in the metagame. And so Gnar is like the kind of the epitome of that. And it's partially why, if you go back and look, we're playing a lot of things like Nautilus and allowing a lot of compositions because Warden's so good. But if you don't want to play around Warden, you can just play like Ornn, for example, as a +1 Dryad. Let's say you get a Dryad emblem, you can play around that. If you get a +1 Ink Shadow, definitely look for Udyr in the late game because Udyr is really, really good, and just throw like whatever items onto Udyr. That makes sense. He's kind of an AD melee carry, or he can hold tank items. He's also extremely good with Tattoo of Force, so if you find Tattoo of Force, get a third item for Aatrox and put it onto Udyr. So that's if you go for 5 Ink Shadow. And if you get another Warden, just play like, you know, like Wardens that make sense. So just put Ornn with the Warden and then go for full Warden. Make sure Senna and Gnar are on the same side so that they can line up their damage. And yeah, just watch people unable to kill Gnar and just watch Gnar just basically throw rocks and tell people to kick rocks. Janna is tech that EU innovated during the PB tournament, and many EU players were getting good results. Although the problem with Janna is that she's hit or miss. Sometimes it feels like the lobby just is way too fast for her, and you're not able to kind of scale her shielding. But that's kind of the name of the game with Janna. If you allow her to scale, you will win because you get Rageblade, Archangels, maybe even a second Rageblade, for example, and she just becomes very difficult to deal with because she just deals way too much damage and she scales her shielding too much. So it's kind of funny because she's supposed to be a support champion, but she can actually carry. You end up rolling at 6 with her alongside Zyra 3 and giving Zyra the secondary items. You can give Zyra Shiv, for example, if you end up playing like attack speed onto a Kale, or if you go for the Talisman of Aid for Shred. Instead, you can go for AP items on Zyra. Galio's the best tank. A lot of times you're going to play like early Garen. And right now, the belief is that you want to play around a lot of Dragon Lords with the rest of your slots. But in reality, if you just look at it closely, you can kind of play whatever you want. You can play 4 Bruisers. You can play 2 Wardens because Wardens are OP. You can tech in some Altruists with that Soraka. You could even tech in like Dryad with this Azir, or you can instead play around Sages if you want. Like you can just go for 4 or 5 Sage. So at its core, it's actually a very flexible reroll comp. And you can notice that like even right now, we're only showing 5 units. So how you reroll Janna is almost completely up to you, and we haven't found a way to fully optimize it. I anticipate that about a week or 2 into it, we'll probably figure out more optimal ways to play Janna based off data. But for now, just have fun with it. And most importantly, get Janna 3 ASAP with these 3 items. Very good on things like item-based portals because she's able to get things like Rageblade very quickly. If you have like Janna pair and then you have like completed item anvil and double Rageblade, boom, that's a really good Janna spot. Try to get her going early because you don't want to be stuck on 1 or 2 item Janna on stage 2 and 3. For all the AD flex lovers, Ashe is going to be probably your main bait for the first part of set 11 launch. Ashe is really good with her best item being Rageblade, and then you want to put 2 AD items on her. She is a really good applier of Last Whisper as well, and also Last Whisper gives you that bonus attack damage, so it's kind of nice. And then the last item could be like Gunblade, i.e. Deathblade, Giant Slayer, like a bunch of different items. So these are probably considered to be her best, and it's pretty flexible with how you end up playing her. You could play 2 or 4 Warden, 2 or 4 Porcelain, and basically kind of mix and match. You can even play more snipers if you want, if you get a sniper emblem. Ashe really operates off of the core of basically just a Mumu Ashe plus another sniper. So in this case, we're just using Caitlyn as an example. But you can also play like Ashe with Aphelios and play more of a faded core. And she's just very hyper flexible based off the 2, 4 Porcelain and all that stuff. I will say 4 Porcelain is what really takes her over the top, because if you get a Porcelain emblem, it's really good on frontline units because of the damage reduction that you get. If you do start off with the spatula and you have like an AD item, let's say you have Rageblade slammed because you're like, oh, maybe I'll play like Janna or Bard, and then you pick up a spatula off carousel, you're like, what should I do with this? You can think about Porcelain and look if the people are playing Ashe and then try to lean into that. Very flexible, very good. I think the big problem with Ashe is that she might be really contested because we do have a lot of people who just love to play AD compositions, and she's also a composition people fall back to if they don't know what to play. So be very careful. Being contested on Ashe and you're stuck on Ashe 1 is very bad and weak. So yeah, make sure that you have your front line secure and you have Ashe 2. The most important thing with snipers is that they deal more damage to targets that are further away, which means you need a good front line. If your front line is 1 star and you have Ashe 2, you're probably not going to win many fights because you lose so much of that sniper bonus damage. But if you have 2-star front line and like Ashe 1, you probably can get away with some fights. So always just keep that in mind as you're playing the compositions, but ultimately have fun with making all these different breakpoints and teching in some other stuff that I'm not even thinking about. Zoe is a variation of playing around Arcanists that you can roll for on 7 if you are missing on Syndra. Let's say you're just rolling and you're just not hitting Syndra and you're just somehow hitting like 5-6 Zoes. Then that's actually like a marker for you to just go into Zoe instead. And then another possibility would be that you have Zoe as a good item holder because Zoe 2 is fantastic at holding items, and you just natural into Zoe 3, or you hit something like Infernal Contract. You can definitely play around her, but very similar ultimately to Syndra. The other variation that I've seen with Zoe is like a 2 healthy, 3's a crowd Zoe, which is you just go for all the 2s and 3 costs. You basically play like a really good set of synergy of like Heavenly, Altruist, Sage, Arcanist, Dragon Lord, and just kind of like splash in. You have the Arcanist through the Nico with Zoe. You have the Altruist with Soraka. You have the Sage, which gives you a little bit of buff. And in this case, you can go for like everything 3-star, like Zoe 3, Nico 3, Riven 3, Diana 3, Soraka 3. And this is a really good board to roll for if you have an augment that heavily encourages you to go into like 2 and 3 costs specifically, or you just happen to kind of be locked into a situation where you can't really press for more. And let's say you were trying to play Teemo and you need to pivot. This is a really good option as well. Aphelios is also quite strong, but kind of like we talked about the tier list, he struggles with kind of the mid-late game situation where what happens when you have Aphelios 2, but you're far away from Aphelios 3, you're kind of just dead sometimes. So you have to be very careful. And as a result, it's sometimes even more important that you kind of hit like Ashe 2 or Syndra 2 and itemize them based off of what you're hitting. Because if you are stuck on Aphelios 2 for a really long time, then you kind of need another source of damage. That being said, one thing that's a little bit awkward is if you're playing like Aphelios and you get a bunch of AP items for Syndra, you sometimes don't have Shred for Syndra, and so she gets stuck on a tank as well, and it's not really clean. The nice thing is, if you can snap your finger and get to the late game and hit Aphelios 3, 2-star everything, including set 2, you probably can win the game. And so Aphelios' payoff for being able to weather that mid-game storm is going to be very powerful end game. The early game that you often play is just kind of like a sniper, so you end up going like, you know, Caitlyn or Kog'Maw with like bruisers or wardens to start things off, and you kind of build your way up. And if you get like Rageblade with AD items, and you also notice that he uses similar items to Ashe, so once more, kind of similar to Zoe and Syndra, Aphelios and Ashe have this interchangeability with, hey, maybe I'm playing for Ashe, I hit like 5 Aphelios, and all of a sudden, I'm in a spot where I want to reroll Aphelios instead. You can go for that as well. Thresh 3 is often the tank that you stack, but if you do end up finding like a Mumu 3, definitely go for that. And also remember that Aphelios' ability actually reduces armor as well, so it's not actually as important to build Last Whisper or Even Trap for him. It is nice though, because his ability only gives you 20% reduction of armor, while those items give you 30%. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, like 10%, but as you start thinking in late game of how much armor people stack on, that 30% comes up pretty clutch. So yes, you don't need armor reduction on Aphelios because of his ability, but it doesn't hurt to have extra because in the late game, that could be a difference maker. 7 Storyweaver is also a pretty reliable vertical to play, but it's often dependent on whether or not you can hit a emblem, because the reality is relying on hitting 7 Storyweaver with Irelia is just not very practical. So a lot of times you want to get the 7 Storyweaver online ASAP, and that usually means by getting a +1 Storyweaver. So if you end up getting this spot, Kayle ends up being the carry, and a lot of times what you want to go for with her is to go for a triple red by going for the Talisman Scroll and the Tome of Haste or Speed, and just have Kayle basically essentially hold these items and go crazy. Kayle ends up becoming your carry. Make sure you have Shred for her, and this is a pretty high tempo composition. This reminds me a lot of like Cultists from back in the day, if you remember from set 4, where basically you just rely on the summon to actually deal the damage. And yes, it's like all these units can pitch in and deal damage, but it's actually the summon that's the real carry. So Kayle, just make sure you protect her as best as you can. Gallia holds tank items, you know, Irelia support damage, Zoe support damage. If you have a Storyweaver emblem, just make sure it makes sense, like another Dragon Lord or another Warden, like maybe Rakan is really good as well. Just in general, like make sure that you protect the Kayle as best you can because she can really pop off. And in case you're wondering, yes, 10 Storyweaver is pretty insane, but you need 3 emblems for that. So if you do end up getting 3 Storyweaver, have fun, but you also need to get to level 10. So it's going to be really, really hard. I think Kayle gets something stupid like 680, 600 AP, and then she casts and like explodes the entire board. It's pretty sick. But similar to Cultists, it falls off late game. So when you're playing this composition, you will dominate early mid, but you also will lose the late game. Chances are, in order to win the late game and get beyond like a third or a second, is to probably replace a lot of the Storyweavers, right? You end up cutting things like the Garen and maybe the Zoe and other things like that, and replacing it with higher quality units. That's probably the primary way that you're going to be able to find a way to win the game. Otherwise, you're just probably going to get, top 4. Morgana is one of the most fun carries to play, but she needs help. You have either Kayn, Sylas, or even another carry to kind of help her. Usually you're not playing all 3 of these because, as you know, how are you supposed to get 12 items unless you're in like some kind of crazy portal encounter situation? So that's not going to be very common. You have to kind of pick and choose based on what makes sense. So if you're playing around Kayn and Morgana only, maybe you just don't play around Sylas and you don't play around the Yone and you're not getting like the Umbral Reaper stuff. But instead, you can just play like a 4th Bruiser or a 4th Ghostly instead. And, maybe you end up not hitting Kayn too, and maybe instead you're just kind of splashing it in a bunch of different synergies as long as you're playing dual carry. In reality, I think Kayn and Morgana work together really well because of Ghostly, and Ghostly is nice. If you don't understand Ghostly, the best way I can summarize it is like it's kind of like half of a version of Contagion, because the longer the fight goes, you're kind of having the ghost amplify the damage that they take. And it's kind of like Disco from the previous set, where you kind of get some ticks of healing as fight goes on. So you kind of like mix and match a little bit of it, and it scales the more Ghostly you have. 4 Ghostly is also really reliable. You can actually play it for really cheap if you hit Morgana and Kayn, so you can play like this 4 Ghostly board and get a lot of synergy. Morgana's best items are some kind of mana item. Shojin is just easier to build, but I personally like blue buff a little bit more, but Shojin's what you're going to be building more commonly because of item reasons. And then Morello's her best item because she just hits everything on the board and she gets so much value off of it. Her ability also chills and slows attack speed, kind of like Frozen Heart. So she has like built-in Frozen Heart and built-in like Morello applier. It's just really, really powerful. And so just give her damage so she can amplify that. And this ends up being her best in slot. Kayn just takes like generic fighter warrior items. So you can kind of give him this, or, Hodge, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer. And if you get like good own artifacts like Death Defiance, Infinity Force, just very reliable. Don't feel like you have to play around the Storyweaver core. I mean, as you probably have noticed by now, if you end up just having like Galio, Riven, you can like slot in a bunch of different flexible traits. But for the most part, you can cut everything and just play around like these 4 units and mix and match. Reaper is a big deal. So if we go back to the example where we play around Kayn, we can probably play like Kha'Zix, for example. And hey, who's also a Sage that's a Heavenly? You can also play around Wukong, and you can kind of tech and mix and match. So let's say in this instance, you play around a Ornn, so you get Behemoth to tie in as a frontline unit to go with Shen. And then here you are. You have like a core 7 units, and you actually even have room for an 8. So maybe a 3rd Sage, for example, to get a little bit extra Omnivamp and AP. But if you're on the opposite end, and let's say you're just not hitting Kayn, or you just keep getting flooded with AP items nonstop, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have so much AP, like what do I do? Oh, like Kayn does not want all these AP units. Just go for Sylas instead. And you have optionality behind that. Like maybe Kayn takes things like Death Cap and Spark and a Crown Guard, for example, and now you have all this damage. Make sure you get Umbral. It just increases the efficiency a lot of what Sylas is trying to do. So you can put in the Umbral here. Who knows? Maybe you hit like an Azir, so you have like an Invoker set up, and that's actually kind of nice. Or you can play around Annie as another frontliner, and then you have like a 3rd slot where you can tech in like more Sages. So let's go ahead and play a Diana. So you kind of understand like why I really think highly of Morgana, because she's just so interchangeable based off of having like a core of just hitting 2 Sage, 2 Ghostly. And same thing that goes with mixing, matching Kayn and Sylas, and frankly, kind of any other carry you want to play. So you might be wondering, like, why don't you just play this every game? The reality is, in case you haven't seen by now or picked up on it, it's really expensive. Morgana is usually like a composition that requires a lot of things to go right, mainly that you have a lot of HP and economy, because it's kind of hard to hit everything. If you're stuck on 1-star Morg and 1-star Sylas, 1-star Kayn, 1-star frontline, you're just going to be really struggling, even if everything else is 2-starred. So really you have to make sure that you're rich enough to hit all this. And as a result, people are not used to that, because in set 10 from Remix Rumble, they're used to headliners, and they're just kind of, accustomed to just rolling once or twice, hitting things like their 4 cost, and then being like, I'm stable. That's not really the case with this comp. It's really easy to lose control and just go bot 4 because you were too poor and your spot wasn't good enough to support a comp as expensive as this. But the reward of this is it's so flexible and good, and has a high ceiling, can win games, and so flexible. You can use all kinds of spats. I can't say enough good things about this composition. It's so fun, and I really like it. I really believe it's worth mastering if you want to try to play like an open fluid style. Some brief notes on the B tier comps that I think can do well, but kind of need some high rolls. I think if you get Tattoo of Bombardment, that's a signal that you can try to play around Kai'Sa if you have good AD tempo opener. But other than that, I wouldn't go for it. If you get like Tattoo of Force, like whatever. This is just an example of like if you hit like 5 Ink Shadow and you have 2 items. In this case, I'm just going to remove it. Kai'Sa ends up struggling a lot late game to kind of deal with all the super tanks and big boards that she has to cover. And so in order to really do that, you need to hit Xayah 2. And if your win condition is Xayah 2 to like top 4 reliably, it just feels hard to do. But if you end up playing like a fast 8 strategy or a fast 9 strategy because you hit things like, you know, level up or patient study or other really strong econ augments like rich get richer, try to think about something like Kai'Sa if it makes sense for you. And also you're looking and be like, hey, Ashe is taken. I don't want to play like a Yone reroll comp. I want to think about it. Kai'Sa can do well. It's just not as reliable in my opinion. And the PvE tournament kind of proved that because when some people got to level 9 and hit, they still lost out and got like 5th and 4th from spots that looked like they should have top 2'd. I think Kai'Sa needs a little bit of a buff. Another thing to note, do not play Kai'Sa without Trick Shot. A lot of her power budget for her cast is budgeted in Trick Shot. If you don't play Trick Shot, you're probably going bot 4. And from the rest of it, just mix and match. You don't need 5 Ink Shadow. You can cut a bunch of different things and just like, you know, mix and match whatever makes sense. Heavenly is actually quite a good comp if you get the Heavenly emblem. And if you're able to get to 7 Heavenly, the bonus is out friggin' rageous. Make sure to keep Lee Sin a little bit safer and try to have him duel with Wukong. Also, Soraka take leftover items and you can even chase for a 3-star. You do have a lot of ways you can play the early mid game. And the usual signal besides Heavenly emblem is to just hit like 2-star Heavenly. And also maybe Heavenly is tied with Exalted. So if you're able to, you know, say for example, have like Lee Sin and Malphite as your Exalted, then maybe just like play around that. Otherwise, it's a composition that you keep in your back pocket and you don't play very often because I think it runs into some real big problems, especially with reroll compositions that can take on Lee Sin like a Gnar. So just be very careful about it. Ahri Reroll probably has the potential of being an A tier comp, maybe even S tier, and I'm releasing it in B because I still need to see more of it. The few times I've seen of Ahri are either like spots where it's so high roll because you hit it from like build a bud, right? And you just steamrolled your tempo and all of a sudden you like hit like a faded emblem. It was something crazy, like really fast Ahri 3, really fast hitting 7 faded and just like scaled up. And then there's spots where I've seen people chase it and they just like miss and they go 8th. So it is one of those situations where your results may vary depending on your spot. Ahri is very similar to the previous set where you want Shojin Nashers or Blue Buff in Nashers and either a mana item and an AP item that amplifies her. And she also wants to be positioned in front of the clump because she hits also adjacent enemies with her burst. And other than that, you kind of play her very straightforward like Syndra, but Ahri instead is going to be the main. Yasuo is also really good with tank items. Another way you can try to angle Yasuo is if you get really strong defensive items to him, like, you know, a Hulk Crusher from a Portable Forge or just a lot of tank items in general. Yasuo is actually a reliable tank this set. He's not actually a carry. So just keep that in mind when you're rerolling. Duelists are a comp that was actually terrorizing PBE but got nerfed repeatedly, like Volibear, Lee Sin, and Tristana got repeated nerfs, but still very viable if you're able to get it online. Volibear 3 actually is sometimes just as important as Tristana because Volibear is the tank, and Volibear can also crank out a ton of damage. But the problem with Duelists is that you kind of want to hit 8 Duelists, and you don't get that without an emblem. And you also want like the Duelist combat augment, which is extended duel. That is also just really hard to hit. So I feel like the way you would want to go into this is if you get started with a Duelist emblem early and you have like 2-star Darius with 2-star Yasuo, and you can push your tempo really high. Don't try to get baited by other units. Like, don't really try to go for like Darius 3. You could go for Kiana 3, but it's a little bit on the rare side. And then you just splash in different traits that make sense based off your duelist. Heavenly is always a good splash because you just get a bunch of bonus traits, kind of like Guild from set 7. And then you can also add Dragon Lord for a little bit of extra attack speed. Duelists want combat augments a lot. Try to avoid playing duelists with econ augments. It just doesn't work very well very often. And make sure Tristana's behind Volibear. Kog'Maw Reroll is actually quite solid, but the issue is that you're rarely going to be in a position to play it because I think that you just need the right conditions, like sniper-based augments, and you need to also have like a lot of Kog'Maws. Because if you have like Kog'Maw 3 only and you're not hitting like Cho'Gath and Caitlyn 3, I feel like it's okay. But if you're able to hit like everything and you're able to tempo accordingly and get more mythic in ends up being really solid. The thing is, you notice that if I get everything in here, I'm still missing Shred and anti-heal. And there's like, you just kind of need like so many different things because you want to itemize everything. So it's just rare for you to be in this spot. But if you do end up playing it, you can land in the top 4 and you do end up running into some late game issues, especially if there's carries that get to your back line and close the distance. You can really struggle. So I don't really see people play this really often anymore, but feel free to give it a try if you really like Kog'Maw. Otherwise, I put it at the bottom of B tier for a reason. I don't expect to see it do very much in the meta game unless there's a lot of prevalent one-cost reroll in the meta, or I'm just completely wrong. We talked about Gnar and how to play it with Senna, but you also can play Gnar with Kindred. I do think it's significantly weaker though, and largely relies on hitting Dryad emblems or Dryad augments like Mulched. So I think that I wouldn't be going for Kindred and Gnar if I had the choice to, but it also is a candidate for being good with Twin Terror. I think Twin Terror, Kindred, Gnar has potential. But yeah, in general, it hasn't done particularly super well unless it's from like a really high roll position. The thing that it struggles with is Kindred likes to go AP damage and Gnar likes to go AD damage. So they kind of have some mismatch there. But hey, if you hit fast enough and you have good enough tempo, I've seen it, cruise comfortably to a top 4. And Kindred's a really fun carry. You get to watch Kindred kind of dash and sprint away and just kind of watch Kindred really terrorize the early mid game. So try to play from ahead. Don't play from behind. If you're like, Gnar pair and Kindred pair, you don't hit. You're like 60 HP in the middle of stage 3, and you're just not really putting together any streak. Might be time to kind of ditch it. Instead, utilize things like this to go for another AP carry like Syndra or, Lillia, somebody else. Or try to prioritize going to like Kayn and Morgana. Just something else. Don't try to force this if it's a bad spot. All right, I know that was a lot, but those are all the comps that I think that are viable and strong going into the launch week of set 11. And the crazy thing is, I didn't even talk about things like hero augments, Twin Terror, build different, or even just augment specific things you can pull off. So have a lot of fun, explore a lot, come back to this video if you just want to try 1 or 2 comps and dip back in. But ultimately, most importantly, just have fun and explore. It's a brand new set, and so there's a lot that we have to learn. But one thing's for sure, if there's anything new to learn, I'll be sure to cover it on this YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.